Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, our speaker is Stephanie Thurner, but we're going to give everyone just a few more moments to join us, and we'll begin at 12:30. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the quantitative seminar. Today, we're really excited to have Stephanie Thurner giving our talk today. But first, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. So as I mentioned, today our speaker is Stephanie Thurner. She is from the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. Stephanie has agreed to take questions during her talk today. So if you have a question, please feel free to enter it into the chat, and Stephanie will be able to see those as they come up during the talk. And then at the end of the talk, we'll have more time for questions. And we can also use the chat box at the end for questions, but then we'll also have the raise your hand feature available to just ask questions of Stephanie. So Stephanie received her bachelor's degree in math and biology from Albion College in Michigan. She is currently a master's student in the branch lab, where her research has focused on the use of computer simulations to understand if and when the human harvest of economically valuable species can lead to extinction. And since arriving at SAF, she's also worked on the West Coast widow rockfish update stock assessment and on a research strategy analysis for Cook Inlet beluga whales. And without further ado, welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks for the intro, Andy, and thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to you all. So I'll start with some other thank yous. First, I want to thank Trevor Branch, my advisor, for everything, and Sarah for all of her help on this project. And then our funding is the Richard C. and Lois M. Worthington Endowment. And then I'd also like to thank the Branch Lab and thank all of you for coming today. January has felt like 15 years, not 4 weeks. And so I appreciate you all taking the time to come today and listen during the craziness of the current world. So with that, I will begin. So although extinction itself may ultimately be inevitable, the rate at which it's occurring has been exacerbated by human activity. With compelling evidence showing that Earth is amid its 6th mass extinction, and recent extinction rates are unparalleled in human history and highly unusual in Earth's history. So this plot is from a 2015 science paper and shows the conservative estimates for the extinction rate compared to the dashed line, which is the standard background rate for extinction. Many of the major processes driving this increase in extinction rate are anthropogenic in origin, including habitat loss and climate change. However, many other extinctions are the result of human exploitation. When exploitation is directly targeted on a single species, extinction is expected to be relatively uncommon. This is because as the population size decreases, search costs nearly always begin to outweigh the revenue, except in the obvious cases where species are extraordinarily valuable or can be easily exploited, like dodos. Nevertheless, extinction and serious depletion have been reported for many species. Put this in more concrete terms, how is it possible that the black rhino was hunted to extinction when the cost of finding the last few likely far outweighed the profit from finding them? Many theories seek to answer this question. These include single species pathways such as the Ali effect, where intrinsic biological factors decrease mean individual fitness at low population sizes. This can be through numerous mechanisms, which include mate shortage and inbreeding depression. In such cases, species suffer reproductive failure at low densities, causing a rapid extinction once below a minimum threshold population size. This was the demise of the passenger pigeon. Or an allied hypothesis is the anthropogenic Ali effect, where instead of lower survival at low numbers, income from exploitation increases as population size decreases. The classic case is rare products such as beluga sturgeon caviar becoming disproportionately valuable simply because of their rarity or humans' perception of their rarity. There are also multi-species pathways such as accidental exploitation, which is when a species with no economic value is unintentionally caught while targeting a species with economic value. An example of this would be the vaquita porpoise caught as bycatch. There's also incidental exploitation, which is when a less desirable species with lower economic value is exploited while pursuing the target species. This pathway is common in fisheries, with a specific case being the incidental bycatch of shark species on long lines targeting tuna and swordfish. Another multi-species pathway which Trevor proposed in 2013 is opportunistic exploitation. This often unnoticed and destructive extinction pathway occurs when a rare species that has high monetary value is stumbled upon during the exploitation of a more frequently encountered, less valued target species. This method allows for valuable yet scarce species to be exploited due to large profits and low search costs. This is a conceptual figure from Trevor's paper, where the x-axis is a measure of population size and shows how the harvest of a second species allows for profitable harvest at lower population sizes than harvesting one species alone. Opportunistic exploitation is widespread and is more destructive than other multi-species extinction pathways since there is economic encouragement to continue exploiting the species. So this is a bunch of examples that Trevor has in his 2013 paper. I'll talk through two of them. So one example of opportunistic exploitation is the selective logging of the big leaf mahogany tree in Central and South America. Around 93 to 95% of these very valuable trees were removed by conventional logging. As logging for lower valued trees continued, when a mahogany was encountered, it was felled. These big leaf mahogany missed during the first wave are largely eliminated by chance during the second wave, leaving the forest filled with low value trees. Another example of opportunistic exploitation, which I will frame the rest of my talk in terms of, is the harvest of rhinos and elephants. Black rhinoceroses were hunted to extinction in Zambia, even though illegally poaching rhino alone was not profitable due to their rarity. Illegal poaching was profitable when elephants and rhinos were hunted together. As rhinos became rare, elephants became the main target. Thus, opportunistic exploitation contributed to the extinction of the black rhino. So, although opportunistic exploitation is likely a destructive pathway to extinction, it's also the least understood. We used individual-based models to replicate the conditions that lead to extinction from human exploitation to further examine this and look at the key biological and economic factors that are influencing this. So to start, we first identified factors that were likely to influence extinction risk of an exploited species. These included things like patchiness in the distribution of the species, how easy it was to capture them, the population dynamics of that species, so their growth rate, how much the exploiters knew about their distribution, and how profitable it was. So I want to show this first, and thank you to Kathy Schwartz for creating this figure for us. We created individual-based models to examine the effect of key biological and economic factors that influence extinction risk. We simulated the harvest of either one or two species with no change over time within each simulation and how well the exploiters were able to predict the location of individual animals. We simulated system dynamics on a spatial grid, Each exploiter could enter the grid once per time step, with cost increasing with distance traveled from a single entry point on the outside of the grid. Each exploiter could capture either 0 or 1 individuals, and they were all assumed to be identical in knowledge, cost, and searchabilities. And then we use these models to assess both single species and multi-species modes of extinction. I'm going to step through this framework one piece at a time. So first, I'll talk about how we generated habitat quality grids and how we distributed animals. So habitat quality grids were generated using random fields, and we used the random fields package in R. So with this, covariance changes between sites as a Matern function of distance, and we could generate grids along a gradient from random to patchy by changing the smoothness parameter of the Matern function. And we generated 500 habitat quality grids for each species, and we used the same ones across time, or across simulations. And the starting population size, which is the carrying capacity for each species, was distributed into the respective grids in proportion to habitat quality using draws from a multinomial. Just to give an example of what this could look like, the top row would be an example where there was only 1 species, and the bottom row would be an example of where we put 2 species in a grid. So the red would be rhinos and the gray could be elephants. So next I'll talk to you about the population dynamics and the movement. So at the beginning of each time step, the population for each species changed according to the discrete time logistic growth equation with Poisson process error shown by the equations on the screen. They're the typical logistic growth equations. And we assume that the population started at carrying capacity and that no individuals were captured in year 0. So once we determined how many individuals there were after population growth, we redistributed the individuals proportional to habitat quality using the same process we applied in the previous step. So once all of the individuals are placed in the grid and they've moved and they've grown, we create the profit grid. So first we calculated cost. So cost for the harvest of 1 individual depended on a variable cost, which was multiplied by distance, a fixed cost per trip. So that fixed cost could include things like gear, labor, opportunity cost, and then a capture cost, which would be like ammunition and labor needed to capture an individual, and that is 0 if no individual is captured. Exploiters entered the grid at a specified location and moved to the center of a cell. So we just calculated the distance as a straight line. And so the total cost of capturing an individual in each site is shown on the screen. After this, exploiters could enter the grid sequentially with no prior knowledge of where they went the year before or where other exploiters have gone. And we assumed that each exploiter could only capture 1 individual in a given time step. So to implement this, we first calculated the probability of encountering at least 1 individual of species S at a given site, which is the 0 class of a binomial. And that's shown on the screen. And it's worth noting that for this, the definition of catchability would be the probability of encountering 1 individual of species S at a site given it's there. And we assume that if an individual is encountered, it can be caught or captured or cut down, depending on what you're looking at. We then calculated the potential gross revenue matrix, which is the expected gross revenue from successfully exploiting species 1, plus the expected gross revenue from successfully exploiting species 2 if you did not exploit species 1 in each site. We assume that if both species are encountered in a given cell, the more valuable species will always be exploited. And then we can calculate the potential net revenue by subtracting cost. Of key importance in the scenarios we run, and as reflected by this equation, species 1 will be the rarer and more valuable species, and species 2 is the more common and less valuable species, to mimic the kinds of scenarios that can lead to opportunistic exploitation. Bia asked a question. If you have a 0 capture, but you did spend resources, how would you incorporate this into the model? So I would include those as the fixed and variable cost. So the gas and all of that is variable depending on distance, I would assume. And then anything that you have to spend money on to even get there or to enter the system would be included in the fixed cost. So we added a capture cost because we wanted to make sure that, like, you wouldn't take an animal if it cost more to take it than it was worth. So we just wanted to make sure, like, this wasn't accounting for, like, if you saw something that was worth nothing, you wouldn't take it. I hope that answered your question. So we also included observation error. So to relax the assumption of perfect knowledge, we included observation error in the net revenue grid. So this converts the potential net revenue grid into a perceived net revenue grid, where which is the observed net revenue grid on which the exploiters act and accounts for their imperfect knowledge. We assumed that the coefficient of variation for this observation error was the same for all exploiters in all time steps. So then you can add that to the potential net revenue, which is shown by the O at the bottom. So now that we have calculated the perceived net profit, the exploiters can actually go out and catch things. So we calculated the probability of an individual exploiter going to each site using fleet dynamics equations from Hilborn et al. 2006. So in these equations, D is the concentration coefficient, and high values of D result in more concentrated effort in sites with higher expected net revenue. So if D is low, that means you kind of just go out wherever and they don't concentrate in the areas of high value. And when D is really high, almost everyone goes to the highest value place. So that gives us B, where B again is the probability of going to a given site. Once we have that, the exploiters were assigned to a site using a multinomial draw with probability B. Andre asked a question. No noise in the spatial allocation. No, I did not put noise in the spatial allocation. But that's a good point and something I could consider for other things to look at. Yes, just the multinomial. That's all the noise. I don't remember where I was, but if an exploiter is assigned to go to a site and that site has a negative perceived net revenue, they don't go. And then once assigned to a site, we conduct binomial draws for each species to determine if either species was encountered using that probability of success P we defined earlier. If both species are encountered, the more valuable species is taken. So to kind of show how this works, these are those same grids I showed earlier, and we can put this out over time, 300 years. So in the top scenario, there's 242 rhino left. And in the bottom scenario, there's no rhino, but there's 1,550 elephants. At the end of every simulation, we calculated the proportion of each population remaining. So depletion was calculated as the proportion of the individual population that was remaining for each species in each simulation. So again, looking at that one simulation run, it would be 0.242 for the rhino in the top row and 0 for the rhino in the bottom row. I have another comment from Andre. Binomial assumes independent sampling. For the high density species, one might expect over dispersion or clumping. Yes. I definitely think that that may be an assumption I have slightly violated, and I should think about that. Hi, Tim. Okay. Sorry, my screen's got all messed up. So we looked at 4 scenarios. The first scenario would be like a single species base case, so your only species of interest is rhino. We looked at an ALI effect. I'll go into the equations on the next slide. We looked at an anthropogenic ALI effect, and then we looked at a multi-species case where we had 2 species, so rhino and elephant, and the elephant are twice as common but half as valuable. So for the ALI effect, in populations affected by the ALI effect, as population size decreases, per capita rate of increase declines. So instead of increasing, as we would expect under negative density dependence, they're decreasing. And we modified this equation from Hilborn et al. 2014 by adding the portion of the equation in the red box. And in this portion of the equation, there's a parameter N50. And N50 is the number of individuals in the population where the population growth rate declines by 50%. So just to give an example of how this would change, the black line in that plot in the bottom right is just normal surplus production from a logistic growth equation, and then the red would be the surplus production from an ALI effect added. And in that plot, that N50 is specified to be 25% of carrying capacity. And then for the anthropogenic ALI effect, the value of product increases considerably at low abundance. So we assumed the revenue abundance relationship in Holden and McDonald-Madden from 2017. And in this, I put again an example of what this would look like, where the x-axis is population size and the y-axis is revenue. And when there's only one individual left, it doubles what they're worth. And again, this relationship, you can kind of make it whatever you want. This is what we used, but that could change. I keep waiting for another question to pop up. So this plot summarizes 500 simulations from each scenario. The median is bold lines. The 5th and 95th quantiles are thin lines. The x-axis is year. The y-axis is that metrics, which is final over initial population size. And so kind of what we took away from this is that the multi-species attributes of an exploitation scenario are as important as the attributes of individual species for predicting depletion. We could kind of look into this more to see what was going on. And in all of these scenarios, the spatial distribution of individuals played an important role. And the nearer the rare species was to the entry point, on average, the more depleted it was at the end of the simulations. So in this plot, the x-axis shows the median distance of individuals of a given species in year 0 from the entry point of the grid. And the y-axis shows the depletion of that species in year 300. The top row shows results for the single species scenario, and the bottom row shows the results for each species in the multi-species base case. The solid lines are just linear regressions fit to the data with 90% predicted intervals. And you can see here that the distance of the common species from the entry point didn't really matter. All that really mattered was the distance of the rare, more valuable species. Additionally, in the multi-species case, declines were greater when the starting population grids were more correlated between the two species. So in this plot, the x-axis is the starting grid correlation between the two species, and the y-axis shows the final year depletion in the two species model minus the final year depletion in the single species base model. For all negative values on the y-axis, the rare species was more depleted in the two species model. Again, the solid line shows a linear regression fit to the data, and the dashed line shows the 90% predicted interval. So as the starting grids are more correlated, there is greater depletion. And that makes sense. So that kind of was validating, I guess. So after looking at all of this, I guess I should have put a table of parameter values. We had run the simulations with general large species traits or values. And obviously we knew results would be sensitive to whatever parameter values we chose. So we wanted to look at the sensitivity of depletion to all of those parameters. And so I'm going to step through a few slides where we looked at that. So these plots will show up on the next two slides too. And panels indicate the median final year depletion of the rare species in red and the common species in gray across 500 simulations for each sensitivity. The purple triangles on the x-axis show the value of each parameter in the base case opportunistic exploitation scenario, which is the table I should have put in this talk. And I think, so for each row, there are things that stick out, I guess. And in this one, like as expected, the rare species was more depleted when it had a higher gross revenue. Additionally, the rare species was more depleted when the common species had a higher revenue. Populations with higher growth rates can sustain higher levels of exploitation. So when the common species had a higher growth rate than the rare species, its population is maintained at a larger size. This allows exploiters to continue to profitably search areas for longer periods of time, encountering more of the rare species. That's consistent with the high threat of overexploitation and high trophic level, large-bodied, slow-growing, and low-fecundity species. So those species could face additional pressure when harvested alongside a faster-growing species, analogous to pressure faced by multi-species fisheries, where less productive stocks are commonly overfished. So I think the big takeaway from this row of sensitivities is the larger the carrying capacity of the common species, the more depletion there is of the rare species. So when there are more individuals of the common species, the increased gross revenue in the system allows for more encounters of the rare species. This can be compared to hyperpredation, where a supplemental food source for predators allows them to increase in abundance and drives down particular prey species, such as introduced rabbits subsidizing a cat population, which can then deplete native birds. The ease of capture of each species also plays a vital role and was one of the few factors with a close correlation to extinction risk. So this is the last row, and not only do the underlying economics of the system matter, but the exploiter's perception of the profitability of the system matters as well. When the exploiters have perfect knowledge about the expected net revenue of each site, they never visit sites with a negative expected net revenue. These sites may have individuals of the rare species in them, but they're economically extinct. When the exploiters have slightly imperfect knowledge, however, there is some probability that they will visit sites they would not have visited given perfect knowledge, and thus they can further deplete the rare species. As uncertainty continues to increase, though, both species become less depleted. In such circumstances, neither species is targeted, but instead both are randomly captured, a bit like throwing darts blindfolded. So all of this to say is it is important that understand how decisions are being made by exploiters when investigating the potential for extinction. Our model of exploiter behavior is incredibly simplistic, which is opening up an avenue for future work to develop better models of human learning and knowledge acquisition. As expected, as costs increase, the population is less depleted. The common species is more impacted by changes in costs because they're less valuable, and a diminished ability to profitably harvest the common species decreases the intensity of opportunistic exploitation. So I did not expect to get through 42 slides this fast, but I will keep going. So I want to go through what I think are the big takeaways. So first, when compared to our base case model, the Ali effect, the anthropogenic Ali effect, and opportunistic exploitation all increase depletion of the rare species, capturing the effects predicted by the original theories. While opportunistic exploitation caused the quickest decline, the Ali effect, the anthropogenic Ali effect, and opportunistic exploitation result in comparable equilibrium depletion levels. Next, as predicted by Branch et al., 2013, under certain circumstances, opportunistic exploitation can result in increased depletion or extinction of the rarer and more valuable species that would not occur in a single species scenario. We identify high gross revenue, ease of capture, and high population size as the more common and less valuable species as the main factors that increase the effect of opportunistic exploitation. Next, spatially correlated distributions among species greatly increase depletion risk to rare species. As climate changes, the distributions of many species will shift in latitude, elevation, and elevation, resulting in sympatry of species that were formerly separated. Thus, as we study the impact of these range shifts, it will be important to understand how the spatial distributions of harvest will change, how local communities will change, and where new instances of opportunistic exploitation can emerge. We also assume that each species had an equivalent range size and that they can move anywhere in our grid. We therefore could not draw conclusions about the impact of range on the effect of opportunistic exploitation. However, it is well recognized in the literature that geographic range size is a strong predictor of extinction vulnerability, where species with small range sizes are most at risk. However, given these results, it's reasonable to hypothesize that the impact of range size on depletion would be largest when the rare species had a small range that completely overlapped with good habitat for the common species, since high spatial correlation is associated with further depletion. Our models also assume that each extinction pathway acts in isolation. In reality, extinction risk will be increased due to the interactions between extinction pathways. Opportunistic exploitation could lead to the target species passing below an Ali effect threshold, or a greater increase in price due to the anthropogenic Ali effect, potentially leading to greater depletion than either pathway would cause independently. Additionally, we only simulated situations with one or two species that are exploited. In reality, in many ecosystems, there are more than two species which are being exploited. Examples of that would include the logging of many tree species that resulted in the decline of large-leaf mahogany. We expect the impact of opportunistic exploitation to be magnified when more than two species are harvested, since this is analogous to increasing the common species population size and gross revenue or further reducing search costs. So while the simplicity of our model allows for generalizations, it does not include specific ecological attributes of each species or behavioral attributes of the exploiter that could have significant impacts on the depletion of each species. Future work could take advantage of advances in machine learning to allow exploiters to automatically improve their search techniques over time with increased knowledge of species distribution, to investigate the impacts of opportunistic exploitation within metapopulations and build models based on the specific attributes of species that are likely to be impacted by opportunistic exploitation. Another dimension that could be explored in great detail is criminality and the impact of punitive costs or perceived enforcement on exploiter behavior. Conservation budgets are insufficient to conserve all of the world's biodiversity, and there's increasing pressure for triage investment. giving resources to the most endangered or charismatic species. Oh, sorry. Will not usually maximize the number of species saved. However, investments in multi-species systems may be effective at maintaining biodiversity when targeted at rare species that are vulnerable due to the profitable exploitation of more common species. Additionally, our work highlights the critical importance of tracking emerging markets. Species that were once safe because exploitation was unprofitable could face new risks if harvest is initiated on common species in the same area. This occurred when the bottom trawl fishery off of India's coast commercialized formerly discarded bycatch species, which allowed the continued harvest of rare species beyond the former point of unprofitability. As managers and researchers continue to understand which species are most at risk of extinction and how to best spend conservation resources, a priority should be placed on protecting rare species that are most likely to be the target of opportunistic exploitation. I don't know how I talk so fast for 50 slides, and I'm really sorry. But with that, one thank you is not enough, and I want to thank Trevor and Sarah again, who are co-authors on this project, our funding, and the branch lab. And that is all I have.
And thank you, Stephanie, for the great talk. We have lots of time for questions here. So if folks want to, they can type questions into the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand feature and we can selectively unmute you. We'll give folks a minute to do that. That's sort of the awkward space and time here in our new online.
It's totally okay if there aren't any.
Let's see here. I think we have one coming in here.
Thanks, Tim. You're too kind.
Tim has asked if this was a great talk or the greatest ever.
Andre asked, is there any lessons to learn about? Andre, can you unmute yourself? I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay, Andre, you should be able to.
Okay, apparently I'm unmuted. It's a great talk. Nothing wrong about getting through 50 slides in 30 minutes. That's a good talent. But I was thinking in terms of what, in incentives, I guess, of how to avoid this kind of thing. And what was crossing my mind initially was the salmon bycatch in the pollock fishery, which is sort of an unintended exploitation that's led to some changes in behavior. And I was wondering if your work had any inference about that kind of thing, because you didn't really talk about incentives. And obviously in many fisheries contexts, this is going on and we do nasty things to people who end up taking the protected species.
Yeah, that's kind of what Sarah added actually to the conclusion of the paper not that long ago. Basically that exact thing. And I've read a lot of the literature on this, and that's actually why I didn't include it in the model, because it's very scenario dependent. So in a lot of places, they basically say that like putting heavy fines or increasing enforcement in those areas actually doesn't impact anything because the incentive is still so high. So I don't know very much, for being a staff student actually, about pollock and salmon, but to know what those incentives are. But I guess that from the literature is kind of what they're saying. I don't know if do they sell salmon bycatch? Like, is there value?
Actually, the guy sitting next to you will know better. Andy lives breed. I was more thinking, what in your model what incentive as a manager, you can't change carrying capacity, right? You can't tell the animals to move differently. But I was more thinking as a manager, what of all the variables you've got can you impose that would lead to, essentially less impact on the target, if you want to call it, species, and protect the incidental species. That's the salmon example. Is, Andy will take your license away if you catch too much salmon.
I was going to say that an increasing cost, but I don't know if there's a legal way to increase cost. But yeah, I think increasing cost, and the other parameter that would lead into that would be making it harder to capture them. But again, I don't think that translates as well to fisheries as it does to things like rhinos. I wish I had a better answer for you, and I will think about it more. I promise. Oh boy. Kelly asked, if you had to speculate, do you think there would be much of a difference between how this dynamic would play out in marine versus terrestrial systems? That was kind of what I was just saying to Andre. I think there's, I think opportunistic exploitation can happen in both. So there are examples of opportunistic exploitation in marine systems, like the sea cucumber fishery, harvesting whales. So they harvested all the blue whales, and then they went to the next value species, but they still kept finding blue whales based on those other searches. And then I think you could count the trawl fishery off of India's coast as an example. When I was making this model, I think that I was thinking more about terrestrial systems. So I think the same concepts apply, but there could be differences, especially in how the exploiters in this model are working in marine systems. If that didn't answer your question, Kelly, send another message. So, okay, I made it bigger. The question box is really small, fun fact for people watching. In this case, you're modeling two species that can be actively targeted. How would the models change for species that are non-targeted or unregulated fisheries? Bia, do you mean that there's value even if you don't target them, or for like bycatch?
Bia, you're unmuted. Or you can unmute yourself, I should say.
Do this. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Oh my gosh, it took me forever. I don't know how to do this. Yeah, the question was like more of bycatch. Sorry, I want to type something more concise, but I cannot see what I'm typing in the box. So yeah, so the question was like towards how the model would differ, but I think you kind of like answered that already. But my curiosity was like how the model would differ from like bycatch or on target. I'm thinking more of like unregulated, illegal, unregulated fisheries standpoint, that they're like targeting something, but sometimes they can get like this bycatch that's actually valuable. So I don't know if it makes any sense, but it's just something that I was thinking.
I think I'm following. When I was looking at those sensitivities, I kept the scenarios the same as the opportunistic exploitation. So there was one species that was like always more valuable, and then another species that was less valuable. So I think for the scenario you're talking about, if the species they aren't targeting is super valuable, then this already applies. And then if they're less valuable, I think that would be more of like bycatch and less of opportunistic exploitation. But I think that a lot of the same factors are going to impact how much that species is depleted, especially like how valuable it is relative to everything else, how easy it is to catch, those kinds of things. Did that answer it?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. See you at lab meeting. Oh, Trevor. What would need to be done to model more intelligent poachers? you put examples, and I think those examples are exactly what it is. So artificial intelligence, machine learning stuff, I think would be needed, and I have no idea how to do that, but I'm guessing it's being done if it's not already, if it hasn't already been done. And I think it would be really awesome, because then you could track each individual poacher could change. Like you could have different skill levels, like maybe there's 5 who are really, really amazing and they keep learning and they keep doing things. But yeah, you would definitely need some form of machine learning that I don't know how to do. Also, hi, and see you later too. Mike asked, in examples where capture events are relatively rare and highly valuable, could that incentivize cooperation among exploiters, and could greater communication among them increase average pressure across the landscape? Yes, I 1000% think that is correct. And I think that would feed beautifully into Trevor's previous question. And that would be, there's so much you could do in this with tracking or modeling different exploiter behaviors. And I think that would be really awesome, because I think you're right. You're definitely right. Oh. And then there's a bunch of highs.
Okay, well, that's all the questions in the question box, and I don't see any more hands raised here. So thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
That was a great talk. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you will join us next week.